Hey guys, it's Megan with Fiveable. I'm here tonight to go over AP Psychology. We are starting our development unit tonight, and we are going to cover cognitive and social development specifically. We've got quite a bit of slides to get through tonight, so we probably won't have some review questions at the end, but next week I plan on doing a heavy dose of review from the development unit. So tonight will be probably all new content, and then next week we will do some review from the development unit. As always, just some reminders at the bottom of your screen where it says ask a question. You can always pop in and ask a question. It'll send me a little notification while I'm talking, and I can come back to it then. Or feel free to talk in the chat as well. I kind of go back and forth, whatever works for you guys. Our development unit tonight. So next week then we've got the end of the development unit, which focuses on psychosocial development, gender, and sexuality, which kind of gets lumped into the development unit. And then we'll also do a heavy dose of review. Now, the Tuesday after that, we're going to do common psychological misconceptions. If you are not part of the Facebook group, I would strongly suggest Googling Fiveable AP Psychology students. We have a Facebook group. We're trying to get it a little more active, and I posted there last night. But if you have anything you would like to see reviewed that week, I'm open to suggestions. I'm going to talk a little bit about hypnosis, lie detector tests, ESP, different things like that. So if you have any issues you want to see debunked or confirmed in regards to psychology, make a comment and I will get to it. But yeah, every Tuesday, 8 p.m., we'll be here. So jumping in then, we haven't talked about the development unit so far. And so the whole focus of this unit is basically how humans change throughout the lifespan. And it's mostly humans that we focus on in this unit. And so we focus all the way on prenatal development, so like in the womb before the baby is even born, all the way up through death and dying. And so it's really a broad spectrum of things that we cover in this unit. And so there's a lot of kind of info to get into, but we'll look at some of the patterns and things that'll make it a little bit easier to understand. This is a bigger unit. It makes up 7 to 9% of the AP exam. And then some of the main kind of topics that we'll get into are cognitive developments, like thinking, thought processes, social development, moral development, and then psychosocial, which maybe you don't know a whole lot about, but you will after next week. So jumping right in to the unit, before we get into specific stages of development, one argument that is had throughout all of the different developmental psychologists is basically, do we develop in like a continuous motion, or are there like really set rigid stages of development? And so this is a debate that's ongoing in psychology. It's called continuity versus stages. And I would say that typically speaking, it's more of a continuum, right? It's not like one thing, it's not rigid. It happens kind of at different paces for different people, but typically speaking, as we develop, most people develop in a similar order. So if we're talking about physical development, usually you have to be able to roll over before you can crawl. You have to be able to crawl before you can stand before you can walk. And so we might all do it at different times, but it happens in the same order. It happens along a continuum for everyone. This image here is showing kind of how the different psychologists that we're going to talk about throughout this unit view development. Lawrence Kohlberg is focusing on morality development, and you can kind of then see at the bottom there, it says like birth, 1 year, 2 years, 3 years old. So you can kind of get a time frame of when his stages of development take place. We'll talk about Erikson next time. His stages are there, and then Jean Piaget we'll talk about today. But I would say this might be a useful graphic to come back to as you're reviewing and preparing for your test, because it lays all of the psychologists out there. It puts them on this continuum, and it kind of helps you see them in comparison to one another. So just think about whether or not how you view development or how these different psychologists view development. Is it something that happens in like a continuum, or are there set rigid stages? And that's kind of a debate that depends on which psychologist you ask. The other thing that's another kind of conversation that psychologists are having or have about development is stability versus change. And basically, think about it like this. Do I have the same personality that I had when I was 2 years old, when I was 6 years old, when I was 10 years old, and onward? And so psychologists are interested in studying whether or not certain traits and certain characteristics, whether it's personality or temperament or things like that, remain stable throughout our lifetime, or are there things that actually change as we mature and grow? And so temperament is something that's relatively stable throughout our lives. So our kind of like reactivity to situations, that's something that doesn't change a whole lot. We're pretty stable in that aspect. Obviously, something could happen, like you could have like a terrible tragedy or something, and that could alter your personality or your temperament a little bit. But typically speaking, that temperament is something that's stable throughout our lifetime. Other stuff, though, like our social attitudes, are much less stable. We tend to adopt our parents' social attitudes towards like religion, politics, things like that when we're younger. Typically speaking, when we go off to college, we swing towards a more liberal viewpoint with our social attitudes. And then as we age, we swing back to a little more conservative attitude. And so those are things that are more likely to change in our lifetime. So if we're looking at whether it's one or the other, it matters more specifically what we're talking about: personality versus social attitudes versus preferences, things like that. And so both are important. Our stability is what makes us who we are, right? Our identity doesn't often shift very drastically throughout our lives. But the fact that we are capable of change gives us hope to grow and to mature. And so both are important, both matter, but it is something that psychologists look for to help us understand how throughout our lifespan then we can expect to see stability or change occurring. Okay, my clicker's not working. There we go. So we are going to go very early development right now, just because I want to highlight a couple of the things you need to know. So in regards to prenatal development, you do need to know just kind of the three main phases. The zygote, which is the first phase, where we have a fertilized egg. That's a 2-week period of rapid cell division, and then we get the embryo. The embryo then is where we start to see more human-like features. It moves from less of a basically like a bundle of cells into more of a humanoid form. That's from about 2 weeks to 2 months. And then the fetus is the last phase where we actually would like look at it and it would look like that sonogram does there, more like an actual baby. But the reason why we care about this, because you're thinking, well, this is a psychology class. Why do I care about a baby like in the womb? It doesn't really have a personality and it doesn't really maybe have like thoughts, you could say, or things like that. But the reason that it does matter is because prenatal development really can set the tone for the future baby, the child's lifespan. And so what really matters here is thinking about this, and it is teratogens. And teratogens are agents such as a chemical. It could be like drugs or alcohol, or a virus that you get when you're pregnant that can actually get into the embryo or the fetus and cause harm. And so while the baby is in the womb, we might not think it has a personality, or it might not be something we'd study in psychology. But if a teratogen affects it, it is something that we care about because it impacts then that life once the baby is born. And so we would see the effects of those things. Drugs, alcohol. So remember, anything that goes into the mom goes into the baby and can cause harm and damage. So teratogens are bad, things we wouldn't want you to consume while pregnant that would impact then harming the fetus, which then harms the baby as it's born and into its lifespan. And one really common form of teratogen is alcohol. And so the resulting impact of alcohol on a fetus is often fetal alcohol syndrome. And so with fetal alcohol syndrome, we would see physical and cognitive abnormalities. There's a variety of symptoms, including like mental disabilities, physical disabilities, abnormalities. And so you could see why we care then about prenatal development, because it's something that happened before the baby was even born. But now that it is born, it's impacting its development throughout its lifespan. So just kind of understanding some of that stuff. That's why we study prenatal development in psychology as well. But that's really probably the gist of what you need to know. I don't know that you need to know much biology about like sperm and egg and things like that. It's more so about the 3 phases of development in the womb and then the teratogens. All right. So now baby's born, and there's a few things that we study in newborns. There's a lot of innate, like inborn. If we say innate, it means you're born with it. Reflexes that babies have, and some of them are really interesting. One is the rooting reflex. And basically, these are survival techniques that babies are born with. And so it's not necessarily something they develop because they're born with it, but we still need to like set the stage for further development. So the rooting reflex is interesting. I don't know if you have any baby siblings or baby cousins, or maybe you're an auntie or an uncle to a baby, but you can try this. If you go up to a baby and you just kind of brush their cheek, like right here near their mouth, they're automatically going to turn and open their mouth. And that's called the rooting reflex because they're searching for their food source, the bottle or the nipple. And so it's just an inborn reflex that babies have because they know, oh, if something's touching my cheek here, that means food. I need to eat to live and to survive. So if you have any baby cousins or in your family, try that out. You'll probably see them do that, and they'll probably latch on to your finger, and then they'll probably be upset that you aren't giving them food. But it's a little mini experiment that you can do with babies. We also know that babies, interestingly enough, prefer human voices, human faces, the smell and sound of their mother. And we know this through little baby experiments. So those 2 kind of purple images there at the bottom of your screen, the one looks more like 2 eyes and a mouth. And so we hold those pictures up for babies to look at. And babies actually spend a longer amount of time looking at the one that is more similar to a face. And it's because babies like to look at things that are familiar and study them. And so they prefer human voices, human images. Also, the smell of their mother can be really comforting. So if like mom has to go to work and there's a babysitter, giving infants like a shirt or something that smells like mom can actually be really comforting to them. So babies aren't just like blank, empty blobs. There's stuff going on inside that shows that they have some intelligence and learning, and they're capable of different aspects. We also know that babies can learn, which is really interesting. These 2 graphs show us that. And so habituation is an important term in psychology. It means basically we have a decreasing response when we're repeatedly shown the same stimulus. So think about it. If I play a loud noise, the first time it scares you. But if I keep playing that loud noise over and over again, you're going to habituate. You're going to learn that that noise is nothing harmful. And so your reaction is going to decrease every time I blow the air horn near you because you're getting used to it. You're habituating to it. The same thing is true with newborns. Typically, we'll show them a toy. That's usually how they do this, some like brightly colored toy, and they'll hold it over the baby's head. And so on the upper right hand here, we see this graph, and it shows you the first time we show them a new toy, babies look at it for like over a minute. They'll sit and they'll stare at it and look at it and really try and like take it all in. But the green bar graph shows you if I show that baby that same toy over and over again, they may only look at it for about 20 seconds. And so we know there's a distinct difference there, over 70 seconds compared to about 20 seconds, that babies have learned to identify those objects. And so once they see it over and over again, it's not as interesting to them. They've habituated. They've learned what that thing is. And so basically this proves to us that babies know that something is new or something is not new, which means they are capable of learning, maybe not in the way that we normally consider learning, but they are capable of learning, which is an important, again, tool to understanding development. Because if we just assume that babies can't learn, then we miss out on a whole host of ways to helping young children and babies' development really early on. And so it's important to understand that they're not just a blank little blob. They are taking in information and learning as we go. This is an interesting aspect as well to development, and it relates to their physical, actual, like brain development. So at birth, those pink lines represent the cortical neurons, the neurons in their brain. And we've already talked about neurons, but basically it's all of the connections that grow and strengthen over time that allow us to do what we do. And so maturation is a process that we go through in the brain and in the body. Maturation sounds like maturing, so that should kind of help you understand. But basically, when we study infant development and we study their brain development, you can see at birth they don't have a ton of cortical connections. So it is limited what babies can do. They're not completely blank, but they can't just start talking, right? It's just not physically possible. And so what happens is, as the babies age, these neurons fill in. You can see from at birth to 3 months to 15 months, there's a ton of development happening in the brain. And what happens is these biological processes, the filling in of the neurons, is what allows babies to develop from just laying there to being able to roll over, to being able to crawl and walk and talk and do these things. So it's actually like not physically possible for you to like potty train your kid before a certain age because they don't have the brain capacity yet to do that thing, or talk, or whatever it is you're trying to get your kid to do. And this brain maturation is really pretty uninfluenced by experience. It happens very similarly for most people, most kids. That's why you kind of have these benchmarks that babies start crawling at so many months, walking at so many months, talking by a certain age, because it kind of happens the same for almost everyone. And so this maturation really sets the course for future development, because if those brain connections don't fill in, then it's not possible for those babies to like develop beyond what's happening. Experience then kind of helps them adjust and fine tune it as they go. But I think that's an important thing to understand with physical development, is that babies aren't capable of doing a lot of those things like rolling over, walking, whatever, when they're first born, because their brain isn't able to support that function yet. And we can see as it fills in, it grows. So that's important to understand. We kind of have to lay the groundwork here of these physical changes that are happening in the brain before we can actually talk about how we develop thought processes and abstract thinking and logic and things like that, because we first need the neurons to do that. So understanding this first is important for us to move on. Motor development then is related to this. This is already kind of what I mentioned, but rolling before sitting, crawling before walking, and the baby behaviors, as I mentioned, are occurring because the nervous system is maturing and refining its skills. And what's interesting is that there's been studies done and that our genetics actually do play a role in this. So like identical twins often begin walking on almost the exact same day. They share the same genetic code. And so it's interesting to see how that code actually evolves and advances, and it allows them to develop many of the same skills at about the same time. We're going to skip that because we're already kind of going long on time. We've got a lot to cover. All right. So now we're moving on to actual cognitive development. So I just really wanted to lay the groundwork there for some of the physical processes that are happening in the body that are allowing this to happen. And so cognitive development then is how a child or a person or anyone really learns anything. And the big name that you need to know with cognitive development is Piaget. And so make sure you have that like written in your notebook in all capital letters and underlined, because he's a very, very important person. And so Piaget would argue that as a child, we learn things in kind of three steps. First step is that we develop a schema. And a schema of something is like a concept or an idea, like what a representation of something is. So for example, a child sees a dog. So there's a picture there of my dog, and learns that a dog has 4 legs and a tail and floppy ears and a pointy nose. And so now baby associates this image here with dog. This is dog to the baby. They have a schema or an idea for dog. However, what happens is then maybe baby sees these 2 dogs. And the child says, well, these don't look exactly like the first dog. So they have to assimilate new information into their schema. So as a child develops and refines their cognitive skills, they assimilate more information into their original schema. So a child may see many different types of dogs, tall dogs, short dogs, skinny dogs, fluffy dogs, whatever. And they have to learn that even though they all look a little bit different, they're all still called dog. And so that's an assimilation of information into their schema. Another example of this might be with like a chair. Maybe a baby develops a high chair, that's their schema of chair. But then they hear their parents call the living room couch or the living room like recliner a chair as well. And so they have to assimilate that information into their like concept or schema of chair. They all look different, but if you sit on it, it's a chair. So you have to kind of refine your information. And then the last process in like cognitive development and cognitive learning is accommodation. So maybe a child sees a picture of a cat and it's fluffy and it has 4 legs and it has a tail. And so they would say, oh, doggy, because that's what they've learned, right? That all 4-legged, fluffy, tailed creatures are dogs. And then their mom might point out to them, no, no, honey, that's a cat. And so they have to accommodate or adjust their to take in this even new information and develop a new schema. So a child sees a cat and learns that even though it's similar to a dog, it's called a cat. So now they've accommodated and built kind of a new schema for cat. I hope that makes sense, right? So we start with like a basic concept and then we refine it through assimilation. We take in more information and then we accommodate it and develop new and separate schemas for other things. If you have any questions about that, throw them in the chat because that's kind of an important 3-step process there that you have to know. Schema, assimilation, accommodation. And I think the dog, cat example is probably the best way to illustrate that, at least in my experience. So if you're confused about that, throw me a question in the chat. Otherwise, we're going to keep on talking about Piaget. So Piaget also said that there were stages to human development. And so we're going to go through the few stages that exist. The first is called the sensorimotor stage. You do have to kind of know the age ranges. It's helpful. So just kind of having to memorize them. And then understanding what happens at each stage is really important. So the sensorimotor stage is from when you're born to when you reach about 2 years old. And it's called sensory motor because think about what babies do at this stage. They take in the world through their senses. If you give a baby something, what is the first thing they often do? Boom, right in the mouth. That's what they do. That's why babies choke on stuff, is because that's their way of like testing things out, right into the mouth. They, touch and grab and mouth things. And so sensory, senses, and then motor, movement, that's really the way that babies learn, is through those things. Another common skill, I guess you could say, that develops at this age is object permanence. Infants lack this until about 8 months old. And so what happens is that if you can't see it, they don't think it's there. It just stops existing. So that's why babies get really sad when their parents leave. If they can't see mom, oh my gosh, mom's gone. She doesn't exist. Or if you think about playing peekaboo with a baby, like think about it. If the baby can't see you, they think you've literally like disappeared. You're gone. And so all of a sudden, boom, you're back in peekaboo. That like freaks a baby out. They're like, whoa, that's really cool. All of a sudden you disappeared. Now you're back. You disappeared. You're back. And that's why peekaboo for young babies is kind of thrilling, because they're actually like shocked that you're still there, because they lack this idea of object permanence. Another interesting thing that experimenters have studied is that even really young children can do what we call baby math. And that's displayed here by the graphic on the bottom of the page. So they've done experiments like this where they'll set a baby in front of the stage. They'll place the 2 objects, like you can see the 2 little dolls or mice there. They cover up the 2 dolls. A hand reaches in, pulls one of the dolls out. And so you would expect if one of the dolls disappeared, that when we open the stage back up, there's 1 doll there. So that's the expected response. If we show the babies the expected response, they kind of look at it. They're not too shocked by it. But if we do the experiment and we take that one doll away, but then we show them that there's still 2 dolls in the stage, babies have a really interesting response. They look at it, they look really shocked, they sit there and stare at it for a really long time. And remember, we talked about before, that's how we tell when babies like are learning or interested in something, is the longer they look at it. And so when we show them the like mathematically impossible response, they sit there and stare at it for a really long time. It really like trips them up. So even at a very young age, it may not be actual math that they're doing, but we know that babies understand some of these basic qualities. So sensorimotor stage, age birth to 2, they develop object permanence, and they have some baby math skills. That's kind of the gist of that stage. Once you graduate from the sensorimotor stage, then you move on to what's called the pre-operational stage. And this is from about 2 to 6 years old. And so again, it's not a rigid specific process, so we can't just say, oh, it starts exactly at 2 and ends exactly at 6, because everyone's a little bit different. Even though we go through the things in the same order, the timing of which they happen can be different. From this stage, there's a few things that kind of stick out. We develop our language skills, which is probably the most important thing that happens at this stage, being able to actually like communicate verbally with our parents and with the world. That's pretty important. We do a lot of pretend play, so imagination and things like that are really, really big at this age. We're too young yet at that age to perform like mental operations, so like mental math and things like that are just a little too complex, because our brain networks have not developed yet that capability to do those sorts of things. It's not because little kids are stupid, it's because they're not capable yet because of their brains to do those things. And then the key things at this stage is what they can't do yet. It's kind of like once they develop these skills listed, then they've moved on to the next stage. So they can't understand conservation. And what that means is if I have kind of like a short, fat glass with water in it, and then I have a tall, narrow tube of water. If I'm showing them the 2 cups, the short, fat glass has water, I pour it into the tall, skinny tube, so the water goes a lot higher. You would ask them which water or which glass has more water. And even though they saw me pour the exact same amount of liquid from one to the other, they would say the tall, skinny one has more liquid because it looks bigger and it looks fuller. So they like don't understand that like objects or things retain their like mass or their properties. They also really struggle with symbolic thinking, so like representation and things like that. And they begin to form theory of mind, but they're really quite egocentric. And they're not like egocentric in the way that I think we call someone like an egotist, but really what it means is that they can't perceive things from someone else's perspective. They can't understand feelings from someone else's perspective, or they can't even really understand that I can't see what they see. If I had a 2-year-old sitting and facing me right now, I would say, what do I see? What does Megan see? And they would describe what they think they see, because they don't understand that them and I are not the same person. And so they have a really hard time of like putting themselves in someone else's shoes and understanding perspective from another viewpoint. And that's something that starts to develop at this stage, but it won't fully be there until the next stage. The third stage then in Piaget's development is called the concrete operational stage. And this is, it's called concrete, so it's all about like logic and math and things like that. So from about age 8 to 11, you're in this stage, and this is where you develop your logical thinking skills. You can understand theory of mind, you can understand conservation. So like I said, once you've mastered those skills, you've moved from the pre-operational stage to the concrete operational stage. You understand basic analogies, and then like mathematical operations that like 4 plus 6 equals 10, therefore 10 minus 6 equals 4. Typically like a test question about this would just probably ask you, Susie can do this. Which stage of development would she be in? And it would be like, do basic math operations, and that's really all you have to identify. I would say the ages are important if you get stuck, but I don't think they're ever going to ask you specifically if Susie is age 9, what stage of development is she in? I think that's not something I would see. It's more about the skills of what's happening in each stage of development that's important to understand. All right, and then the last stage, according to Piaget, is our formal operational stage, and this happens starting around age 12 to adulthood. And this is where we really get like our critical thinking and our abstract skills. We can do like geometry and algebra and more complex operations. I mean, it's called formal operational, so it becomes those more refined, more formal skills. This is also where we start to develop our own kind of moral code or moral reasoning. So like little kids are really like black and white, like that's right or that's wrong. Like you stole from the store, that's wrong. But someone in the formal operational stage might be able to say, well, his wife and children are at home starving. So yes, stealing from the store is wrong, but I can see why he did it. So there's like a gray area there, right? You're able to like kind of reason abstractly through problems, basically, is what's happening. So this is when you become more of an adult. And so really what's interesting here is you would think by age 12, your brain would be like fully developed, right? But that's not the case. Your brain doesn't actually stop to reach your like early 20s. And so this stage doesn't just start and end at age 12. You really, even now, are developing. Your frontal lobe is the last part to really fully develop and form. And so that deals with like planning and judgment and all of these kind of formal skills that we're developing. So you could see why teenagers maybe make risky decisions or things like that, because you're still in this formal operational stage of development, getting all of those skills and things. All right, any questions about Piaget's stages specifically? Otherwise, we're going to kind of reflect on what this tells us about development, and then we're going to move on to social development. I'll start reflecting right now on Piaget, and if you have any questions, throw them in there, please. So what do we care about Piaget? So there's a few things. We would say we would not ignore the ages today, but we're less concerned about the specific ages that he says things happened and more about the sequence. This happens first, then this happens second. Today, we see it as more of a continuous process. So that gets back to that continuum versus stages argument from the beginning. And so it's not that Piaget was wrong. I think it's just that we have a more refined way of understanding it today. And so it's we get it. The sequences happen in a specific order, but we're not necessarily tied to the ages that he said. And it's a continuum and not like rigid structured stages. And why do we care about Piaget? Well, as a teacher, I care about Piaget because it helps me understand you guys as teenagers more and your development and your skills and capabilities as learners. So, and you know, like people who work for daycare or parents or elementary school teachers, or if you have younger siblings, like maybe this will help you understand them a little bit more too. Their cognitive processes that are happening in their heads. There's one other psychologist that goes into this cognitive perspective. You don't need to know a ton about Vygotsky, but I want you to at least recognize the name because it does pop up once in a while. And basically, Vygotsky says that we learn in a little bit of a different way than what Piaget says. Vygotsky says that we're kind of like young apprentices. And so we learn by watching others around us. It's our social environment that helps us cognitively develop. So watching other people, listening to other people. And he believes in this idea of like scaffolding. And so first we learn this one low level skill and then we build on it, and build on it, which kind of makes sense, right? You don't just, from the get-go start doing algebra. You have to build or scaffold your way up to the top of doing algebra or any other skill, really. So Vygotsky is more about social learning and then scaffolding. And that's really, I would say, most of what you need to know about Vygotsky. But I wanted to at least put the name out there because it sometimes pops up on the test. Piaget is a much more common name, but Vygotsky may pop up as well. All right. So on to our social development then. So cognitive is all about our thinking and thought processes, right? What's happening in the brain that's allowing us to have complex thoughts, learning, things like that. Social development then kind of has to do with our environment, our kind of personality, things like that. And so there's a couple aspects of social development that are important. First, stranger anxiety. So that's really kind of the first way we socially interact with the world, is just with like basically our parents, and then everyone else is kind of like strangers to us. And so stranger anxiety is something that occurs in infants. And it begins around age 8 months or so, when babies really start to like recognize who like mom and dad are, or siblings are. And so there's a lot of fear and anxiety about people who aren't mom and dad and whoever else is important in their lives. But stranger anxiety can kind of be mitigated a little bit depending on attachment style. And attachment is really important in social development and in psychology, so you need to know about this. Basically, attachment refers to an infant's emotional tie with another person. And young people or young children have obviously attachment mostly to their parents. And they show this by seeking closeness to the caregiver. Like, think about it. If you see a little kid fall down on the playground, what do? Usually they go running to mom to pick them up. And that shows that they have an attachment to mom. Mom can give them comfort and make them feel good. And there's a famous psychologist named Mary Ainsworth, you need to know that name, and she did a study called The Strange Situation to test the different ways that infants are attached to their mothers. And so there's kind of two types of attachment. There's like a good one and a bad one. The good form of attachment, positive attachment, we put the infants, basically how this experiment works is the mom and the baby, not infant, maybe like toddler, I guess we'll say like 2-3 years old. The mom and the toddler go into like a doctor's office, and it's just them. A stranger might walk in and sit down. What happens is that mom will get up and leave the room. And so the baby is left without their caregiver, without that attachment figure. And so what's going to happen? Well, babies cry, right? They have stranger anxiety. They're upset. They don't know where they are. Their mom is gone. So the babies all cry and freak out. That's normal, whether you have a positive attachment or a negative attachment. Either way, babies are going to cry. What we're actually looking at in this experiment is what happens when mom comes back a few minutes later. And so in a good attachment or a positive attachment, we see as soon as mom walks in, the child might run over and like cling to her leg or want to be picked up, and they'll be comforted by mom. So that's a good thing. Like, yes, the baby experienced some stress when she left, but that's to be expected. But when she comes back, they immediately are comforted and feel better because of mom. A more negative attachment style would be mom comes back into the room and the baby's like pissed. It might turn its back on its mom. The mom can't comfort it. It's angry. It's fearful. And so that's what we look for in attachment style, is the response that the baby or the toddler has when mom comes back in the room. And so we want babies to have positive attachments. They can experience stress out in the world, just like, teenagers do. You might experience stress throughout your day, but if you have a positive influence at home to come home to, your parents, your siblings, and friends, that can kind of like return you to your neutral state. And so that's important, because this early attachment to your parents really sets the stage throughout your life about how you're going to handle situations and how you're going to approach life. And so really these are important things that we learn, because we want parents to develop those positive attachments and have those skills so that later on their children develop like positive coping skills. Another famous social experiment is Harry Harlow, and he's going to study about attachment as well. These experiments, it's fascinating, but it's also really sad when we talk about these experiments. So Harry Harlow does experiments with these little monkeys. They're rhesus monkeys. And what they do is the babies are born in a lab, and they separate them from their mothers right away. And what Harlow wants to discover is whether infant attachment, so again, we're studying attachment, comes directly from the fact that the mom feeds the monkey, or if it comes from actual like loving, feeling, and comfort. So is it just solely from food, or does it come from a place of like actual comfort? And so they separate these baby monkeys from their moms, and they live in wire cages. And so then they place feeders in the cages. And you can see on the right there, that's the example. They have two mommies. They have a wire mommy, and the wire mommy is just like a wire cage with the nipple on it for feeding it milk. The other mommy is a cloth mommy on the right, and it doesn't give the monkey any food, but it gives it comfort because it's soft and comforting. And so what they found with this experiment was that, as you can see, this monkey clings to the cloth mommy, even though the cloth mommy gives it no food, no nourishment, no really anything to help it survive, but it gives it that physical comfort, that feeling of attachment. And so even while it's feeding off the wire mommy, it's clinging to the cloth one, which gives it its comfort. And so basically, Harlow's experiments tell us that we develop attachment not because we're fed from our mothers, but because we're actually given that feeling of comfort and security. And so what ends up happening in his experiments, and some of this is pretty sad, but the monkeys were scared because they didn't have any other social interaction. They didn't have like real monkeys to interact with. They often displayed sometimes autistic like features, what we would consider like autism today. A lot of times they would rock back and forth. One even was so stressed it like chewed off its own paws. Just a lot of like horrible things happened to these monkeys because they weren't properly social developed. They weren't given, other monkeys to play with, other monkeys to interact with. So we really learned that there's kind of three keys then to proper social development, and these apply to monkeys as humans. Touch is important. So again, that cloth mommy, super important to the babies for feeling comforted. Motion is also important. Some of the monkeys were given a cloth mommy that like rocked back and forth as well as being cloth. Those monkeys were actually closer to like normal. They didn't have as many problems or abnormalities. And then play is the third key factor. So touch, motion, play. Play is important. Monkeys who had the rocking cloth mommy and were allowed even just 30 minutes a day to play with another monkey were completely normal. And so it really shows us the like detriments and the fears of what social isolation can do, especially in regards to the development of a young human or animal. And so really this stresses the importance of those things of touch and motion and play and interaction. And so we learned a lot from Harlow, but also today I don't know that we would be allowed to do some of the experiments just because of how kind of cruel we think it was maybe to some of the animals. Other implications of Harlow, just things that we learned. The monkeys who weren't properly mothered when they became adults, they were not good moms. So we know that we learn a lot of our social development of how to become a parent and how to become a mother from these early interactions. Because these motherless monkeys would kill their own infants, not raise them, none of them were really properly adequate mothers because they never had those social interactions when they were growing up. So we really, again, are stressing the importance of positive parental figures in our lifetime to like help development forward. This has also been applied to like orphanages. I don't know if you've ever like heard about the Romanian orphanages. Like in the 1980s, there was just rampant problems, like children just locked in rooms, not given any sort of social interaction, things like that. And so by applying like Harlow's ideas to that, we've really refined, or at least tried to refine, how children are treated in foster care and in orphanages, and really early on in their lives laying the groundwork so that we don't see repeat cycles of abuse and like long-lasting mental and emotional scars. So Harlow's important in regards to social development. So hopefully you've gotten that. The other thing that's important then that Harlow tells us a little bit about, but what we need to focus on then is parenting, because it's clear now that how we're parented at a young age has an impact later on in who we are and who we become. And so there's 4 main styles of parenting that psychology looks at. And this is the last thing we're going to talk about tonight is parenting styles. So any questions, last minute questions, get them in now because this is our last little topic here. So the 4 main parenting styles are authoritative, authoritarian, permissive, and then basically like neglectful. And so I'm going to go through like the not so good ones first. So basically a neglectful or rejectful parent is unsupportive, and they also don't demand much of their child. So really, there's really not a relationship there. The parent is uninvolved, the parent might be absent, but it's not a good thing, right? There's zero parental control or involvement, and not good. Permissive parenting, on the other hand, I'm sure you know people who are permissive parents. They're the ones whose kids can do whatever they want. They never get in trouble. They can have huge parties or stay out late, and their parents don't care because their parents are super duper supportive, which sounds great, right? Like, we all want supportive parents, but they also have like low expectations for their child. And so the parent is indulgent. They don't try to enforce any rules. And so it's like too far permissive, basically. So a permissive parent, I'm sure you're thinking of like a friend right now who that like fits that bill. But basically the child can do no wrong. They can do whatever they want. The parent just indulges them. Then we've got the authoritarian parent. And I'm not saying that these are like bad parenting styles. It doesn't mean your parents, if they have a lot of control over you, are bad parents. What I'm saying is that psychologically speaking, the authoritative parenting style tends to have the best results. That doesn't mean if, oh my gosh, my parents are permissive, I'm going to grow up to be a failure. Not true at all. Just from a psychological perspective, this is what we would see as like an ideal model. So authoritarian and parenting is the parents really demanding, like, you got to get good grades, you got to be on home on time, you got to do this sport and this activity. But they're also a little bit more unsupportive. So they might not let you have a say in anything. It's because I said so, that's why. So they have high expectations, but they also don't let you have a lot of input in those expectations. So that's authoritarian. And so how I remember that is like, if you think about authoritarian governments, they have all the control over their citizens and they demand a lot. That's kind of how an authoritarian parent works as well. So then that moves us to the authoritative parenting style, and this is kind of our ideal. They make demands. They expect you should get good grades. I'd love it if you were involved in some clubs or some sports or music, and they want you to have high expectations, but they're also supportive. They seek out input from the child. There's a reciprocal give and take there. It's not just because I said so. It's, well, let's talk through it. Why do you think this isn't a fair rule? Or maybe we can lift your curfew till midnight this weekend because you've done really well recently on a test. And so there's give and take. There's back and forth in the relationship. It's positive and supportive, but also demanding and has high expectations. And so if we're talking about social development, like I said, we've seen, like, psychologically speaking, the best results when we get into that authoritative parenting range, because it's modeling that appropriate behavior and expecting kind of kids to rise to that level. And so the very last thing here then is, are these parenting styles correlated, or is there an actual cause and effect here for developing more like positive, self-reliant children? So if you think back to the research methods unit, we can't just say, yep, this parenting style causes, right? We can't say it causes more competent children, but we can see that there's a relationship that exists. And there's 3 ways to look at it. It could be that authoritative parents lead to self-reliant, socially competent children. Because of those skills that the parent has, we then see the outcome of self-reliant children. Or maybe the parenting style actually reflects the child. If you just have traits that make you self-reliant and competent, your parents are more likely to get your input and still have high expectations, but have a give and take relationship. Or when we're talking about correlation, there could be some third overarching factor that contributes to both the parenting style and the self-reliant, competent child. So maybe it has to do with higher level of parental education, or having like a middle or upper class income, having a positive marriage, or the genetics involved. And so we can't say that, like, oh yeah, if you do the authoritative parenting style, you're going to, for sure, one is going to lead to the other. We just see that there is a relationship that tends to exist there. And so when we talk about social development, we would encourage, to try as much as we can to have that sort of parenting style. All right, we covered a lot of information today. This is a big unit. Like I said, next week we are going to go go over psychosocial development, a little bit about gender and sexuality, and then I'm going to throw in a bunch of reviews. So we'll have some multiple choice questions. I'll have a practice FRQ prompt that we can go through, and so we'll really circle back to some of this information and incorporate some of the new information. As always, make sure to follow us on Crowdcast so that you get to all of the up-to-date information. We've got a YouTube channel. Join the student Facebook group. You can post questions. I post resources on there. If you have questions, I can get you practice worksheets, practice problems, things to help you. And then always, register for upcoming live reviews and make sure you're getting in before the price changes here at Vygotsky. So any questions, feel free to reach out to me on the Facebook page. Otherwise, I will see you next week when we finish up the unit. Have a great one. Bye.